This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
A commercial-free version of this podcast is available on Patreon for $1 per month. Patreon.com/Beyond Contempt podcast. I'm Renee, and this is Beyond Contempt True Crime. Boy bands, pretty much not my thing. I'm more of a punk, post-punk, hip-hop, or rock kind of girl. Groups like Menudo and New Edition were some of the first boy bands that I can recall growing up with. When I hit middle school, all of my friends were insane for New Kids on the Block. They were the biggest thing around. I never understood it, even back then. But I recently watched a documentary called The Boy Band Con on YouTube, and it was fascinating. The way these groups were constructed and taken advantage of was unbelievable. So I thought this would make a really good episode. You're listening to episode 28, Lou Pearlman. Louis J. Pearlman was born on June 19, 1954 in New York, to parents Herman and Renee. Herman went by the name Hi and ran a dry cleaning store. Renee was a school lunch aide. The small family lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens. Hi and Renee slept in the living room on a fold-out couch, while their only son slept in the bedroom. Lou was an enterprising person and was hustling from a young age. He sold lemonade at age 8 and newspapers at age 10. Lou's cousin was Art Garfunkel, and when Lou was fast approaching his bar mitzvah, Simon and Garfunkel songs like The Sound of Silence or Mrs. Robinson were number 1 on the Billboard charts. Lou bragged to anyone who would listen that he was related to Art Garfunkel, but no one believed him. To everyone's surprise, Art Garfunkel showed up at Lou's bar mitzvah. This was probably the first real infusion of fame and power that Lou experienced. As a young kid, Lou's favorite pastime was looking out his apartment window at the Flushing airport to see the blimps take off and land. Lou was that nerdy, overweight, glasses-wearing kid at school who didn't have many friends. The only friendship he developed was with a boy named Alan Gross. Lou and Alan spent hours playing the board game Life, and Lou would often cheat. One of those times, Alan had grown tired of the cheating and tattled to Lou's mom. Renee Pearlman was blind to the character flaws her son was developing and told Alan to let Lou win. Alan and Lou were on the school newspaper together. They shared a passion for blimps and used their newspaper media credentials to get a ride on one of those blimps at the Flushing airport. During high school and college, Lou and Alan worked on blimp crews in the summer. By the time Lou turned 18, he was still that nerdy, overweight, and glasses-wearing kid. However, he learned how to influence people by turning on the charm. Instead of having very few friends, he was now popular. Alan said Lou even had an entourage. Lou went to Queens College and studied business. It was in college that Lou created his first major business, a sky taxi service. He used his well-honed sales skills to convince investors to purchase a helicopter. Lou leased the helicopter and took New Yorkers where they needed to go. The success of this business then allowed him to create Airship Enterprises with his friend Alan in 1978. Together they had studied the blimp industry, and at that point in time, Goodyear was the only business that was advertising on blimps. Lou ran with that idea and decided their company, Airship Enterprises, would offer advertising on blimps. Lou purchased a logging blimp for $10,000. This kind of blimp was not the nicest looking, and probably not what a company would want to advertise on. Loggers tied up large tree trunks, attached them to the blimp, and hauled them out of the forest. They used Alan's house to make marketing materials, like brochures and video presentations for their new venture. There was always a large divide between the truth and what Lou Pearlman presented as the truth. The blimp took off from Lakehurst, New Jersey, but crashed into trees. Thankfully, there were no injuries. Lou said the blimp crashed because the heat absorbed the gold paint and the helium inside the blimp expanded. Lou had insured the blimp and won $3 million in damages from the insurance company. Alan suspected Lou intended to commit insurance fraud, and that was the purpose of this business. Alan felt this was a deep betrayal of their partnership and friendship. When he confronted Lou, it did not go well. Alan was told to mind his own business and was thrust outside of Lou's inner circle. After 3 years, Alan walked away from their company since his reputation was irreparably damaged by the crash. Alan invested $30,000 in this business and only walked away with $11,000. Lou's next company was called Airship International. He sold penny stocks for his new venture and raised $3 million by 1985. He took that money and bought a 13-year-old blimp. He convinced a McDonald's executive to advertise on the blimp, which drove up the price of stock for his company. In 1991, Lou moved to Orlando and purchased a large blimp hangar. He bought more blimps and closed advertising deals with companies like SeaWorld and MetLife. While this company sounded successful on the surface, Lou was perpetually late paying his employees. In 1992, Airship International lost $2 million, and early in 1994, the company had lost $4 million. The stock price dropped, and of the 5 blimps, only one was operational by the end of 1994. SeaWorld opted to not renew their lease, and that blimp was decommissioned. A blimp advertising a Pink Floyd tour was damaged in a windstorm. 2 of their blimps crashed in North Carolina and Long Island. The lease on their last blimp expired in 1995. Back in the 1980s, Lou started a company called Transcontinental Airlines, which was a service that chartered private planes. Lou proudly boasted that his company had 49 aircrafts and a revenue of $78 million. In reality, this company did not own planes, and Lou would just lease them. Lou took one of Alan's 747 models and put the Transcontinental logo on the side of the airplane. He went to LaGuardia Airport and held up the 747 airplane model in such a way that it appeared lifelike in the photos that were taken. And voila, now investors could believe that Transcontinental Airlines owned a real 747. In the 1990s, the New Kids on the Block chartered a flight with Transcontinental Airlines. Lou was not familiar with whom these performers were. He was dumbfounded how this group of kids could afford a chartered flight. After some research, Lou discovered that this music group made $200 million in record sales and an additional $800 million in touring and merchandise sales. Lou realized that he needed to pivot to the music business, and that's what prompted his move to Orlando. Lou was going to start the next New Kids on the Block. Orlando, Florida was known for attracting young talent who went there in search of theme park jobs. Lou turned on his charm and utilized his sales skills when he dealt with investors or with potential boy band members. They received the royal treatment. Lou sent a private jet to fly them to Orlando. A limo driver picked them up at the airport and drove them to Lou's office. He poured it on thick and acted like he was closing an important deal while on the phone. Lou gave them his transcontinental business card that showed the 40 companies he owned. Jacob Underwood, of the band O-Town, recalls being impressed. He thought if Lou owned all those companies, he must really understand business. Lou made a short video about his life in Orlando, showing off his mansion, boats, jet skis, fleet of luxury cars, and his diamond-studded Rolex. Lou pushed hard to sign Britney Spears and tried to impress her by introducing her to Sylvester Stallone and Hulk Hogan. He even took her for a blimp ride and wanted her to sign a contract to be part of his girl group called Innocence. Britney ended up going the solo artist route, but Innocence would later open for her on tour. Even though Britney slipped through his fingers, he started other famous acts like the Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, O-Town, Take 5, and LFO. Like most of his peers in the music business, Lou did not scout for music acts. He held auditions and constructed them piece by piece. He won over boy band members by letting them drive his Rolls Royce and invited them over for big parties at his mansion. The amount of wealth, that Lou possessed often impressed the parents. A.J. McLean from Backstreet thought Lou reminded him of a happy grown-up kid. Lance Bass from NSYNC said that Lou had the ability to make you feel as if you were the only person in the room, and he was authentically interested in what you were up to. Lou promised Lance's schoolteacher mother that she would not have to work for much longer because her son was going to be a star. After he successfully wined and dined performers and their parents, he sent them to his boy band boot camp. So for 6 to 8 hours a day, the boys learned how to dance and sing without breathing heavily into the microphone. This camp was held in Lou's air hangar, where there was no air conditioning. Even though the conditions were not tolerable, everyone was driven and desired success. Lou was a father figure to many of the boys. They had family dinners where they told him everything, and they even called him Big Papa. He promised them that they would not have to worry about money. There were rumors about Lou that were never confirmed. Some of the boys were warned by a person working at Transcontinental Records that Lou might have a thing for boys, and to be aware if they saw inappropriate behavior. Lou crossed the line, according to Ashley Parker Angel of O-Town. Lou told him that he could give his muscles a pump-up without having to work out. He gave Ashley a massage that made him uncomfortable. The phone rang, and Lou had to take the call, which allowed Ashley to escape the situation. In the rehearsal room, Lou would often tell the boys to take off their shirts so he could see their abs, because they needed to be in shape to sell teen magazines. Lou also violated the privacy of the members of his girl band Innocence. The ladies would tan in the tanning beds at Lou's house. He secretly recorded them and shared the videos with the boys. The first group Lou assembled was the Backstreet Boys. In 1992, A.J. McLean received a classifieds paper in the mail. This paper was called the Blue Sheet and was geared towards people looking for work in the entertainment field. There was an open audition for a vocal harmony doo-wop group, and he wanted to try out. When A.J. auditioned for Lou, he was signed immediately. Howie D. and Nick Carter were signed next. Other original members, Sam Licata and Charles Edwards, were also on the team. Lou set up the contract so he was the president of the group and also their business manager. The other business managers were Sybil Hall and Jeannie Williams. Lou called this band the Florida Backstreet Boys and decided that there would be 1,000 ownership shares distributed between the participants involved in this venture. He would get 300 shares, and everyone else would get 100. In April 1993, manager Sybil Hall left, and Sam Licata and Charles Edwards were replaced by Kevin Richardson and Brian Luttrell. Manager Jeannie Williams left a few months later in July. Kevin Richardson was discovered because Lou's limo driver had known of him. Brian was Kevin's cousin, and that's how he found his way into the group. When the five guys went to Lou's house and sang together for the first time, they felt like they had something special. With all the departures, Lou said he would take on the work of the two departed managers. And when Sam and Charles left, he claimed he would buy back all their ownership shares. Lou only bought shares back from Charles. He did not buy shares back from the others and wanted to dissolve the Florida Backstreet Boys to avoid further buybacks. The agreement that everyone signed was that they would work for the Florida Backstreet Boys for 5 years, with 6 one-year extensions. They were not aware that Lou was going to dissolve the Florida Backstreet Boys to destroy the financial rights of the departed team members. In June 1993, Lou had his associate, Robert Fischetti, legally form the Delaware Backstreet Boys, and Lou would own 100% of this company. Because of the complexity of the business structure, Lou could exploit the Florida Backstreet Boys and siphon off most of Backstreet's earnings into his newly formed company. In September 1993, Lou convinced Backstreet to enter an exclusive management agreement, which made Lou the main stockholder. Through these series of maneuvers, Lou Pearlman owned and controlled the management, merchandise, and touring companies for the Backstreet Boys. Backstreet made their debut performance at SeaWorld in 1993. At first, they only found popularity in Europe and Asia. It wasn't until 1997 that the group found fame in the United States. The breakthrough song was Quit Playing Games with My Heart from their debut album. This song sold 2 million copies and was the most successful single on the Billboard Hot 100. In 1997, the Backstreet Boys not only released their debut album in the U.S., but also released a successful follow-up album internationally called Backstreet's Back. The promoters and Lou were getting paid. The band was popular worldwide, but the band members were not making any money. Something was wrong. We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. Thank you to Best Fiends for sponsoring this episode of Beyond Contempt True Crime. Do you like puzzle games? Do you like to be entertained? Well, I like both of those things. That's why I really enjoy playing Best Fiends. It's a laid-back puzzle game that you play on your phone. I like Best Fiends because they keep it fresh by adding new levels and events every single month. It's a great game to play when I need to take a break from writing true crime scripts. And if my writing for this podcast is even half as creative as the characters in this game, then I know I've made the big time. You can search for Thor's Hammer with Viking Vincent, paint roses red with Card Soldier Edward, or join the Liberty Regatta with Sailor Bob. And you don't need to be tethered to Wi-Fi because you can play without an internet connection. Engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must-play. Download Best Fiends, free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Hi everyone, I wanted to tell you about BetterHelp Online Counseling. It's an affordable service where you can connect with one of their licensed professional therapists. You can find counselors that specialize in anxiety, depression, stress, relationships, trauma, grief, or LGBT issues. I work from home and don't often like to leave my house, so I really appreciate that you can communicate with your counselor from the privacy of your home. There's no need to sit in an uncomfortable waiting room. So many people have been using BetterHelp that they're recruiting additional counselors in all 50 states. It's more affordable than traditional offline counseling. You can start talking with your counselor in less than 24 hours. So if you've been thinking about getting counseling, there's never been a better time because listeners will get 10% off their first month by visiting betterhelp.com/beyondcontempt. Join over 1 million people taking charge of their mental health. Again, that's betterhelp.com/beyondcontempt. Now, back to the show. Now Lou had his template for success, and in 1995, he put together his second boy band, NSYNC. He first signed Chris Kirkpatrick. Chris brought in Justin Timberlake and Joey Fatone. Justin brought in J.C. Chasez. Lou found a fifth guy by the name of Lance Bass, and he came in for an audition. The guy sang the Star-Spangled Banner, and Lou thought it was perfect. Lou put this group through the same paces as Backstreet, but NSYNC did not experience the same initial success. It was more of a slow burn than a quick start. In July 1998, Backstreet was slated to do a concert for the Disney Channel, but they were so physically exhausted from constantly touring that they declined the event. NSYNC stepped in, and that was the spark needed to send them up the charts. Lou created competition and conflict between the two bands. He would dramatically ask if Backstreet knew what NSYNC was doing, and vice versa. The bands started to not like one another and could not be in a room together. This animosity permeated the fans. Either you liked NSYNC or the Backstreet Boys. After solid years of touring and 10 million records sold, NSYNC had only been given $35 per day as a per diem. At that moment, Lance Bass thought $35 per day was a lot of money since he didn't have any other bills to pay. But at the end of touring, they all assumed that they would be receiving a check. The boys put in 18 hours of work each day and were so busy that they didn't have time to look into the fine details of their contract. So Lou took NSYNC and their parents out to dinner. He handed each member an envelope. The guys had been expecting a 6-figure payout, and instead, each member received a $10,000 check. Lance had the sinking feeling that Lou was not being honest with them. The more the band thought about the situation, the more details seemed out of place. If Lou owned a fleet of transcontinental airplanes, why were they flying coach on other airlines? When Lou signed the members of the band, he made himself the 6th member and sold it to the guys as not having to pay a manager. However, Lou seemed to be getting paid more than any member of the band. Justin Timberlake's mom believe that Lou really wished he was the sixth member of these bands. In 1997, the Backstreet Boys were the first ones to take on Lou Pearlman in court. Ryan Luttrell sued Lou, pointing to his pattern of misappropriation and concealment of revenue generated by their band. In 1998, Backstreet parted ways with Lou and paid a settlement to end the exclusive management agreement. In December 2000, Backstreet paid Lou Pearlman $29.5 million to be free of him. They took over the Delaware Backstreet Boys and Backstreet Boys Productions. Nick and Aaron Carter's mom admitted that she knew nothing about the music industry. She was a bit starstruck and was happy that her kids were performing and the fans adored them. After a while, it became obvious to Jane that Lou was buying the boys presents to placate them instead of giving them paychecks. JC from NSYNC had an uncle who was an attorney. When his uncle reviewed their contract, he called it a web of robbery. The NSYNC guys tried to get a better deal with Lou, but he told them that he was entitled to 90% of the money they brought in. They could take or leave their 10%. After that point, Lance no longer felt that Lou was the warm person who cared about them. Instead of paying their way out of the bad contract like Backstreet, the NSYNC boys fought him in court. They were signed to a German label, and there was a loophole in their contract that stated if they weren't signed to an American label within a certain time frame, their contract was void. When they pointed out the loophole to Lou in October 1999, he sued them. During the trial, Lou told the judge that per the six-member agreement, he was NSYNC and owned the name. The judge nearly scoffed at this notion and wanted to know why Lou thought that the five guys standing in front of him, who were on the poster of his daughter's wall, were not NSYNC. The judge ruled in the favor of the band, and they too were free of Lou Pearlman. Even though both bands were free of Lou financially, they felt betrayed by him personally. Lou didn't even pause. He just continued on creating boy bands. But they never reached the success level of an NSYNC or a Backstreet because the boy band craze was getting played out and fans were moving on to other things. Many of the new boy band members who signed on with Lou knew they were getting into bed with the devil. They still signed on the dotted line because they were hungry for success. In 1999, Lou's boy bands were making less than minimum wage while he was buying properties. He bought an 11,000 square foot home in Lake Butler and a waterfront condo in Clearwater. He purchased a few penthouses in Las Vegas, an apartment in New York City, and a place in Hollywood. This was all on the backs of his new music talent. Lou added new businesses like TCBY, Chippendales, and NYPD Pizza under his transcontinental brand. When you build multiple large businesses on a house of cards, it's almost inevitable that everything will collapse eventually. But Lou had an uncanny ability to escape legal trouble. He made a mistake in September 2002 when he purchased a company that was under investigation for fraud. The company was called Options Talent Group, and they worked in malls and stadiums. This company set up potential customers with a photographer to take modeling headshots. The company took payment but did not provide the service. Jacqueline Dowd was the bureau chief of the Economic Crimes Unit in Orlando and was set to investigate Options Talent Group. When Jacqueline's team toured the offices at Options Talent Group, it was obvious that the office staff were putting on a performance. Many people were working, and not one person looked at the investigation team as they walked through the office. A few days had passed since Jacqueline started her investigation, and Florida's new Attorney General, Charlie Crist, stopped it. Lou had been a lifelong Democrat, but in 1997 started contributing money to the Republican Party. From 1997 to 2007, Lou's political contributions added up to over $41,000. Most notably, Lou donated a chunk of money to Charlie Crist's campaign fund, and the investigation into Options Talent Group vanished. Lou attempted to steal from his attorney, J. Cheney Mason, who was owed for litigating the Backstreet Boys settlement. Lou hired another law firm to collect the settlement money. So Mason sued Lou and won $16.5 million in a judgment. Lou sent the payment to Mason via a wire transfer from a German bank, but the money never arrived because the bank didn't exist. Mason was upset and went to the FBI. When Mason sued Lou, Lou had provided a financial statement showing he was all tapped out in the money department. The FBI determined that Lou had all kinds of income from loans he took out since March 2003 from large banks across the United States. Additionally, his companies, homes, and royalties on boy bands amounted to $156 million. The FBI discovered several banks were suing Lou for committing bank fraud. Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney Roger Hanberg took over the case and got a search warrant for Lou's homes and companies. When the FBI raided Lou's workplace, his desk was already cleaned out, as was his home safe. Lou Pearlman was running from the law. On February 1, 2007, Lou was in Germany to receive an award with his boy band, Us Five. The next day, he went back on the run. During that time, the FBI and IRS seized all his files and forced some of his businesses into bankruptcy. A financial writer for the St. Petersburg Times named Helen Huntley received numerous calls and letters from investors who were not happy with Transcontinental Airlines. The investors were concerned that they never received dividends from Lou and were not given access to their money. Helen published a piece outing the company as Lou Pearlman's Ponzi scheme. In 1989, Transcontinental Airlines started offering an employee investment account that had a purported return of 3 to 14%, and you didn't even need to be an employee of the company to invest. Lou gave investors fake insurance and financial certificates that provided them with assurance that their money was safe and secure and the company was performing well. Meanwhile, Lou was not putting that money into special high-yield accounts. He just kept it in a regular account so he could have access to it when necessary. A fake accounting firm called Cohen & Siegel CPAs was created and produced the counterfeit financial records. Lou used some of the funds to pay for an answering service that created the address and phone number for the fraudulent company. Any mail they received was forwarded to one of Lou's associates. Investors knew something was wrong when they could not withdraw the money from their account. There were just over 2,000 people who had invested in Transcontinental savings accounts. They estimated that Lou took in between $95 and $153 million worth of deposits over a 15-year time span. He kept $45 million for himself and his other companies and gave an additional $3.2 million to two of his associates. The sales agents who marketed these investment accounts were paid $7 million. Many of the people who invested in these accounts were Lou's friends and family. One of the investigators said that scamming friends and family is not something that he has seen much of. St. Petersburg Times writer Helen Huntley maintained a blog that kept track of Lou Pearlman's unraveling story. In the middle of 2007, she received an email from a blog reader who spotted Lou in Bali. On June 14, 2007, the FBI showed up in Bali, and when they went to breakfast, they spotted Lou eating alone. Lou was quietly arrested and sent back to Orlando to face his charges. In March 2008, Lou pled guilty to 2 counts of conspiracy involving bank and investor fraud, and 1 count of money laundering, and 1 count of making false claims during a bankruptcy. Lou tried to push out his sentencing because he needed time to get his boy band, Us Five, more notoriety and financial success. He tried to convince the court that this was the path to paying restitution to his victims. The court rejected Lou's request. The trial judge also determined that the banks who lent Lou sizable sums of money were negligent. Had they performed their due diligence, it would have been clear that Transcontinental didn't even own a single plane. In May 2008, the judge handed down a maximum sentence of 25 years to Lou Pearlman. The judge offered Lou an option to cut 1 month off of his sentence for every $1 million he restored to victims. If he could repay $300 million worth of his debt, he would not have to serve any of his sentence. Lou could not take the judge up on this generous offer. The prosecutor had a clear picture of how Lou ran all his fraudulent businesses. Lou was constantly moving money to plug whatever holes sprang a leak. When he needed money to pay an old investor, he would take it from a new investor or a bank loan. And when a bank loan came due, he would take that money from another investor. The investor fraud totaled $250 million, and the bank fraud was an additional $250 million. Only $38 million was recovered, so most of the investors lost their money. The 4 sales agents from the Employee Investor Savings Account program were sentenced to federal prison. Each of the 4 men were sentenced to between 26 and 36 months in prison, and were ordered to pay between just over $500,000 and $29 million in restitution to victims. They were each to pay between $450,000 and $3.3 million back to the government. Lou Pearlman never married or had kids. Alan Gross was probably one of the few friends left that he could call. Lou dialed Alan and told him he needed to get out of prison and someone had framed him. Lou could not find it within himself to acknowledge the truth, but one of the earliest lessons he learned was if you cheat at the game of life, you can win. Chances were slim that he would unlearn that lesson in prison. While in prison, Lou continued hustling. He started a choir and even held auditions. He also tried to start a reality show. On August 19, 2016, while incarcerated in a federal correctional institution in Miami, Lou suffered a heart attack and passed away. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. Please visit beyondcontemptpodcast.com for links to the sources used in this episode. This episode was researched by Haley Gray. Scriptwriting, editing, and all audio production were performed by me. Thank you to new patron Wayne R. I appreciate the support. If you like the show, please leave me a favorable review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much, everyone.
I just wanna take control now. I'm waiting for a different time. My body knows that I am faking. I'm standing on the edge of breaking. Maybe I move too fast, 'cause people just tend to pass. I'm giving you all of me. At least what is left of me, of me. What is left of me, of me. Maybe I move too fast, 'cause people just tend to pass. I'm giving you all of me. At least what is left. All I wanna do is focus, just looking for a bit of purpose. I think I found it in your guidance. Been working on myself in silence. Maybe I move too fast, 'cause people just tend to pass.